Good morning, everyone. We welcome you all here this morning for what we believe to be will be an important and informative hearing. We welcome all of you who are here in the audience. The rules are pretty clear here. We're glad to have you here. There'll be no protesting in here other than and we'll be subject to the usual rules and met with zero tolerance, arrest and banning from the committee. There are people suffering from this right now who made that mistake early on, but haven't been back since. And we, like I said, enjoy having everybody here, but this is business in the United States that needs to be conducted uninterrupted. So today, what we bring to you, the distinguished ranking member and I have worked hard to identify areas that really need to be probed, and today we're going to probe arguably one of the most difficult and frustrating places on the planet, and that is Africa, and specifically Eastern Africa. All of us here know that the United States has a clear national security and economic interest in the East and East Africa and the Horn of Africa region. The region borders key maritime trade routes through the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, and hosts a significant U.S. military presence at our base in Djibouti. The U.S. also conducts robust counterterrorism operations, largely focused on Somalia, in partnership with Kenya and others in the region. But in recent years, violent conflicts in Ethiopia, Sudan, and Somalia have destabilized the region. These conflicts provide fertile ground for violent extremist groups like Al-Shabaab, ISIS, and the Houthis. They enable malign actors like China, Iran, and Russia, and devastate local populations and U.S. national security alike. Sudan in particular is a crisis too few Americans recognize as the world's deadliest ongoing conflict. The Sudanese people are enduring atrocities on a staggering scale: genocide in Darfur, mass displacement, and famine across multiple regions. Sudan is a hotbed of instability and a direct threat to U.S. national security interests. There are no good options or easy outcomes, but that only heightens the need for U.S. attention and leadership. Over the last 4 years, the U.S. reactions to this crisis and many others on the continent were fragmented, reactive, and ineffective. President Trump and this administration have already acted to better protect U.S. national security in the region. In President Trump's first term, his administration engaged in talks with Kenya over a potential free trade agreement, a first for sub-Saharan Africa. And now Secretary Rubio and other senior officials have ramped up engagement and confronted threats from Al-Shabaab and the Islamic State head-on. But these efforts cannot be siloed. They must be part of a broad strategic effort to protect American interests in Africa while also protecting the U.S. taxpayer's pocketbook. That means being clear-eyed about our potential and existing partners in the region. In many cases, these governments are not wholly legitimate, which raises the question of whether engagement is worth the cost. Take, for example, South Sudan. Its government exists based on a peace agreement that its signatories routinely violate. The U.S. played a central role in the country's creation, a legacy that has carried a financial cost well above $10 billion in assistance since independence in 2011. Yet the returns on this investment in terms of securing sustainable peace and a functional state are marginal at best and arguably diminishing. Additionally, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda each face serious domestic challenges that severely limit what U.S. investment can do. This fact, unfortunately, demands our restraint. Many African nations maintain troubling ties with China, including key national security partners. Just last month, President Ruto declared that Kenya, a major non-NATO ally, and China are co-architects of a new world order. That's not just alignment to China, it's allegiance. I submit for the record the text of that speech. I'm going to enter it in the record at the conclusion of the hearing that describes this. Relying on leaders who embrace Beijing so openly is an error. It's time to reassess our relationship with Kenya and others who forge tight bonds with China. And it isn't just an embracement of China, but also the, quote, new world order, end quote. Still, there are countries where meaningful engagement is possible, but only with sober judgment and clear-eyed realism. We must stop building U.S. policy in Africa around individual leaders and instead focus on strengthening institutions, expanding private sector ties, and empowering the region's young and dynamic populations. We hold this hearing at a moment of profound urgency, but also real opportunity. By tailoring our strategy and spending to align with the potential of our partners in the region, we can build stronger partnerships that serve both Africa and U.S. national interests, ultimately making America safer, stronger, and more prosperous. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. With that, I turn to our distinguished ranking member, Senator Shaheen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Like you, I'm delighted that we are able to hold this hearing today. I want to welcome our witnesses, and I think there's a lot of agreement on both sides of the aisle about the importance of Africa to the United States and the need to engage more there. The United States does have a critical role to play on the continent. Just last month, Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo signed a declaration of principles on ending a brutal 30-year war. It's not quite ended yet. However, it's a positive step, and it's the result of deliberate diplomatic work that's been carried out over many years on a bipartisan basis. Unfortunately, this administration's cuts to foreign aid programs have been very damaging when we look at what we need to do on the continent of Africa. While reports from the State Department indicate that life-saving aid continues to flow, what my staff that traveled to Africa 3 weeks ago saw on the ground was very different, and we have some pictures that they took from that trip. This is a clinic that was for an HIV/AIDS prevention site for girls in South Africa. Sadly, as you can see, it's been closed because all of the prevention activities around HIV/AIDS on the continent have been shut down. This is a photo, also in South Africa, of a clinic for vulnerable children, again, around addressing HIV/AIDS. It has also been shut down as the result of the stop in foreign assistance. This final picture is of a hospital in Angola where USAID used to provide ready-to-use therapeutic foods to address starvation and famine. And while there are still cans, those are formula, those are not the ready-to-use therapeutic foods. They're totally out of those. So I hope our witnesses today will talk about the impact that cuts to those life-saving aid programs have on the security not just of the people of Africa, but of the United States, because as we know, what happens there doesn't stay in Africa. We see the impact here in the United States. Rationing HIV drugs gives the virus a chance to mutate into drug-resistant strains. And I also hope you will talk about the competition for influence in Africa between the United States and China. The chairman mentioned that in his remarks. I think it's something that we're seeing. And this is a map that was done in 2023 that shows the influence of China in Africa. I wish we had the one that we had in the Armed Services Committee several years ago that compares China's impact in Africa to the United States, because they are eating our lunch there. And you can see the red is where the PRC has really put a focus on the countries in Africa. You can see the Chinese base in Djibouti. It shows the 2,000 military troops that are deployed in Africa by the Chinese, and 1,775 peacekeepers that support 4 UN peacekeeping operations, again, Chinese. So it is significant that we are not competing either militarily or diplomatically in Africa, and now on the foreign assistance front. One stark example of this is the Libido Corridor Project. It's a US-backed initiative that we've spent years developing and investing in. It would create a route for Central Africa's natural resources to flow east out to the Atlantic. Meanwhile, China has a competing railway project in Tanzania that would send these natural resources east out to the Indian Ocean. I think I said that wrong. It would send the resources west out to the Atlantic. It's in our interest and those of the people in the region for the United States to come out on top in these situations. One piece of legislation that has shown its value time and again is the Women, Peace and Security Act. This is legislation that passed with bipartisan support in both houses. It was signed into law by President Trump during his first term. Our armed forces have made great use of it, especially in AFRICOM. It gives us a real advantage over our Chinese competitors. And sadly, this is a program that Secretary Hegseth has decided to discontinue because he claims it's a DEI program, which is not. But where WPS authorities allow us to gather intelligence from women and families, we can counter violent extremism and we can advance our interests and deepen economic investment in East Africa and the Horn. So as you talk about the opportunities in the region, I hope you will lay out some of the economic and foreign policy tools we can use to achieve success. I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Appreciate that. We have two very distinguished witnesses with us today. We're going to start by hearing from Mr. Joshua Meservey, who is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he focuses on great power competition in Africa, African geopolitics, and counterterrorism. He was previously a research fellow for Africa at the Heritage Foundation, worked at the Atlantic Council's Africa Center for the U.S. Army Special Operations Command, and for Church World Service in Nairobi, Kenya. He is a returned Peace Corps volunteer who served in Zambia and extended his service there to work for the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Mr. Meservey holds a Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University and a BA in History from the Templeton Honors College at Eastern University. Mr. Meservey, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Chairman Risch, Ranking Member Shaheen, and members of the committee, thank you for the honor of testifying today and for your attention to an important region of the world. My name is Joshua Meservey. I'm a senior fellow at Hudson Institute. My views are my own and do not represent an official position of Hudson. East Africa is important to the prosperity and safety of Americans. Because of its natural resources, large populations, and fast-growing economies, it has strong potential as a U.S. investment destination, a market for American goods, and for potential technological breakthroughs. The region's strategic importance is inescapable as well. It commands an important shipping choke point and lane through the Red Sea, which also has a dense concentration of submarine cables. It abuts Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and Djibouti hosts American, Chinese, and other military bases. As difficult as it already is, the security situation could easily worsen. Including Sudan, a conflict that is sowing instability, extracting an immense human toll, and providing opportunities for American competitors, the region could soon host 3 devastating wars if Ethiopia and Eritrea start fighting, and if South Sudan's leaders continue their brinksmanship. Meanwhile, Somalia's Islamist terrorist group al-Shabaab is retaking territory as the government in Mogadishu remains mired in corruption and dysfunction. In a bit of good news, for which the Trump administration deserves credit, the DRC-Rwanda détente is proceeding, though the progress is incomplete and reversible. Further instability will heighten the costs to the U.S. economy and the dangers to Americans in the region, and make it very hard for Washington to seize the opportunities there. Additionally, the U.S.'s primary geopolitical competitors, as well as friendlier but at times still challenging countries, are prioritizing the region. In Djibouti, China built a military base with a pier sufficient to host a Chinese aircraft carrier or nuclear submarine. By participating in anti-piracy patrols in the Gulf of Aden, its vessels have gained experience that could be used against Taiwan or in the South China Sea. Its companies are involved in ports and have built important government buildings throughout the region, and senior Chinese officials have visited over 100 times since 1963. Russia recently reached an agreement to put a logistics center in Port Sudan. This follows naval visits to Eritrea, a naval agreement with Ethiopia, and a flurry of high-level diplomatic visits between Moscow and East African countries. In 2023, Ebrahim Raisi became the first Iranian president to visit Africa in over a decade. He visited Uganda and Kenya. Tehran normalized relations with Sudan the same year and started the process with Somalia last year. Iranian weapons are currently helping the SAF and previously helped the Ethiopian government prevail in the Tigray war. Other outside powers are important as well. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the UAE have invested heavily in East Africa, made large loans to various countries, and involved themselves in different ways in the various conflicts. UAE has funneled so much materiel to the rapid support forces in Sudan that it is likely the only reason the RSF has been able to sustain the operational tempo it has. There are many ways for Washington to ensure Americans benefit from the opportunities in East Africa while protecting against the threats. These include the following. First, create an East Africa strategy that is integrated into a broader Africa and global strategy. Commercial engagement should be at the core of any such strategy. It is critical as well to quickly fill the senior Africa-focused positions at the State Department and NSC. Number two, conduct sober assessments of Washington's ability to positively influence democratic growth and proceed accordingly. For instance, state building in Somalia is a failed experiment, yet Washington hasn't pivoted from over a decade of trying the same thing over and over. Three, upgrade Washington's abilities to support African government and civic institutions and avoid over-reliance on personalities. And fourth and finally, develop a country-focused framework. Washington should concentrate its finite resources in countries that have a baseline level of competence, strategic importance, and willingness to work with the US. The situation in East Africa is difficult, yet vigorous and sustained US diplomacy could avert the worst consequences for the US and reap demonstrable benefits for Americans. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for those thoughtful comments, Mr. Meservey. We're going to turn now to Ambassador Michelle Gavin. She's the Ralph Bunche Senior Fellow for Africa Policy Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She served as U.S. Ambassador to Botswana and the U.S. Representative to the Southern African Development Community from 2011 to 2014. Prior to that, she was a Special Assistant to President Obama and the Senior Director for Africa at the National Security Council, where she led major policy reviews of Sudan and Somalia. She also previously served as Managing Director of the African Center in New York, was an International Affairs Fellow and Adjunct Fellow for Africa at the Council on Foreign Relations. Earlier in her career, she worked in the U.S. Senate, where she was the Staff Director for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee's Subcommittee on African Affairs. Certainly a distinguished position. She was Director of International Policy Issues for Senator Russ Feingold and Legislative Director for Senator Ken Salazar. Ms. Gavin received an Master's in Philosophy and International Relations from Oxford University, where she was a Rhodes Scholar, and earned her BA from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Ambassador Gavin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Shaheen, distinguished members of the committee. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to appear before you and discuss the very complex and challenging set of issues the U.S. confronts. I also really want to thank the staff. I do know from personal experience how much work goes into preparing for these hearings.
I bet you do.
And I'm grateful for that as well. Obviously, the role of Congress in Africa policy has a really long history. It's often been an oasis of bipartisan cooperation. It's one reason I enjoyed working on it for so long. And there are sort of numerous historical examples of Congress really elevating issues that sometimes a busy executive branch is perhaps neglecting. So, of course, as has been discussed, the forces pulling the Horn of Africa apart are gaining strength. There are very real, imminent threats to stability in several other East African countries. Nothing is more searing than Sudan's shockingly destructive war, which shows no sign of ending. The recent wave of drone attacks on Port Sudan, along with the RSF's sustained pressure on El Fasher, confirm that it is indeed possible for this terrible situation, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, to get even worse. And famine, on a scale the world has not seen in decades, remains not just a possibility, but a likelihood. We have multiple civil conflicts persisting in Ethiopia, and Prime Minister Abiy's ambition to regain a presence on the Red Sea has raised tensions with Ethiopia's neighbors. Of course, my colleague is absolutely right. Somalia continues to struggle for a modicum of effective governance while battling al-Qaeda's largest global affiliate, al-Shabaab, and dealing with a chapter of the Islamic State. So China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Turkey, Iran, all of these states are active in the region. Many are very clearly thinking about their relationships in the Horn of Africa through a long-term strategic lens. They're investing in influence. And because their interests are not always aligned, they're sometimes engaging in proxy conflict. And we see this very clearly in Sudan. It's frankly less clear that the United States has a strategic vision for its relationship with the region. Longstanding problems of understaffed embassies and insufficient prioritization of African issues have joined the immediate shock of these very abrupt changes in foreign assistance and international humanitarian aid delivery to make it very easy for adversaries to paint the United States as uninterested and unreliable. Other anti-American messages capitalize on the fact the U.S. has been the most powerful country in the world throughout the post-Cold War era, and they tend to paint Washington as the enforcer of a painful, unjust status quo, which is one reason there's enthusiasm for BRICS in the region, and one reason I'm concerned about the cuts to Voice of America, which has provided some alternative perspectives on global issues. So this widespread perception of disengagement exists despite the fact that the United States, as you rightly noted, has very clear vital interests in this part of the world, not least the free flow of commerce through the Red Sea and combating terrorist organizations with very well-documented intent and, in many cases, experience, track records of doing so, of harming Americans. So part of the problem is uncertainty about just what the U.S. wishes to see in the region, what kind of East Africa is in the U.S. interest, right? We would certainly benefit from a region at peace with capable governments that can be partners in addressing existing and emerging threats. We would benefit from a region with growing economies that can become trading partners, attractive investment destinations, potential collaborators in new enterprises. And we would benefit from a region, vitally, that is not beholden to U.S. adversaries or mortgaged to deep-pocketed external actors whose interests do not always align with ours. And so to pursue this vision, the United States needs to prioritize conflict resolution and conflict prevention. If these seem expensive, I think we've seen through this exercise with the Houthis in Yemen that it's far more expensive to actually have to turn to military action to protect our interests. The United States should avoid, I agree, an over-reliance on personal relationships with any specific regional leaders. Of course, the United States cannot simply impose its will on other states, but there can be no delegating responsibility for pursuing U.S. interests to any partner, not in East Africa and not in the Gulf. And finally, the United States needs to develop and pursue a Red Sea regional strategy, not a set of a la carte deals that transcends our own bureaucratic divisions that put Africa in one basket and the Middle East in another. For several years, I've served with other former U.S. officials on the U.S. Institute of Peace's Red Sea Study Group, which has advocated for this kind of more comprehensive approach to the region. A successful new security architecture would have to take all relevant equities into account. Thank you so much again for the opportunity. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Ambassador. We're now going to go through a 5-minute question round, 5 minutes each, to each of the senators who wish to participate. And I'm going to start. And I have to tell you that watching President Ruhudo with the Chinese holding hands and talking about a new world order is just stunning. After all the work and effort we've put in there, and to see him talking about a new world order, you know, the new world order was constructed by the United States and democracies, capitalist countries that are human rights loving countries, and the new world order that these countries are talking about is being constructed by the autocracies, the outright communists, socialists, people who have no respect for human rights. It's stunning to hear countries talk about wanting to join or promote that world order when the world order that was constructed after World War II has served us so really well. Certainly not perfectly, but then again, the world isn't a perfect place, but so much better than what you'd see if the autocrats took over. It's discouraging to hear that, and part of it, I think, is tied to the fact that when we do things in Africa, they seem to be individual-centric instead of a country-centric. We don't focus on institution, we focus on individuals. And I don't know why it seems to be more prevalent in this part of the world than others. So if each you could take a quick run at a very complex question. So why don't you start?
Thank you, Chairman. I agree. President Ruto's comments were discouraging. They're not also out of the ordinary for the types of comments that Afghan leaders make, especially when they travel to Beijing, unfortunately. This is a challenge for the United States. I would suggest that Afghan leaders haven't always thoroughly thought through the consequences of this different type of world order, especially smaller countries that are smaller military or economic powers. The type of world order that China, Russia, Iran are advocating for would mean that they would be victimized probably in many ways. The grievances that Afghan leaders often express are focused on a few key issues, and then I think these larger powers like China, like Russia, like Iran, have co-opted those issues into their broader agenda to confront the United States. I think the U.S. Should make it clear to Afghan leaders that while, of course, they're welcome to have normal relations with these countries, especially if you're a major non-NATO ally, there are certain responsibilities associated with that. And I think the U.S. needs to be much more aggressive in its messaging, frankly, to Afghan publics and to Afghan leadership about the benefits that you laid out of the world order that the United States has underpinned for decades now.
I appreciate that. And I think you hit on something that probably deserves more thought and more attention, and that is the fact that this is the kind of thing that they're used to. And the reason they're used to it is they see it all over the continent, and they don't have the cadre of people that study in the United States like most other continents do, really. I mean, China, for example, has got hundreds of thousands of students studying here, and Europeans are notorious for having lots of people here. So they're exposed to a different type of government, I think. Ambassador, your thoughts?
Thank you. That's such an interesting last point. I couldn't agree more that bringing more African students to the U.S. Would absolutely be in U.S. interest. We've seen time and again how it can pay dividends down the line, although it's very difficult, actually, for a lot of Africans to come do university and graduate studies here right now.
And the thing that strikes me, too, is when we deal with leaders, as all of us do, from all over the planet, it always amazes me how how good their English is, most of them. And you ask them why, and they studied here in the United States. People who are coming up through those other countries are sent by their parents or their government or something to study here. And the result is they take home the view of how important human rights are and how important democracy is. I'm sorry, I interrupted. Go ahead.
No, I agree with you completely. I do think there's kind of an inflection point in many parts of the continent right now because you have these very young populations that are now urbanizing, digitally connected. There's a lot more political volatility. And so part of what I think is happening is a demand-driven desire for an international order that takes African equities into account, this sort of awareness that the Bretton Woods institutions were created right before most African countries were independent. And then that is capitalized on by U.S. adversaries, right, to distort the message to the U.S. wishes to keep African populations in poverty, or that's more or less the thrust of it. There's also the fact that, money talks. And for a lot of these African leaders, they're dealing with tremendously constrained fiscal space. They have big debt burdens. And the way the U.S. Provides assistance in ways that we can be accountable to the American taxpayers, it's a little bit different dealing with the Chinese or with some of these Gulf actors who've been gaining influence. And so the last thing I would say is that I couldn't agree more that it's really important to keep an eye on the internal dynamics in these countries for the U.S. to understand and have strong contacts and relationships with actors outside of government, because leadership changes are going to happen, and these investments in these one-to-one personal elite relationships will not serve our interests. They'll have a sell-by date, and we'll be left in the cold.
Well, appreciate that, and appreciate the remark you made about the fact that money talks, and we wind up with that all over. It's hard to explain to people that there's a real difference between capitalism and socialism. Where the government owns the capital and owns all the money, it's easy for them to spread it out in other countries as they deem appropriate, whereas in capitalism, you need the profit motive and the free market system to back you up. With that, Senator Shaheen.
Thank you. You both mentioned messaging, and Gavin, you mentioned concerns that we are shutting down Voice of America and other information ways that we can message into places like the Horn of Africa. Can you talk about what we lose when we do that? And I'm going to ask both of you this question because we had a hearing in this committee at the beginning of the year, and one of the things that one of the witnesses told us is that the PRC is spending over $1 billion a year just on misinformation and disinformation campaigns. Much of that obviously is going into Africa. So what's the impact of that, and what's our alternative if we shut down all of our organizations that allow us to correct inaccurate facts, to correct the misinformation campaigns that the PRC and Russia and other adversaries are doing? You want to begin? Sure.
I think it's actually incredibly important because it's not just the PRC. You're absolutely right. They've made massive investments in media on the continent, including hiring local reporters who then are delivering state-approved messages and slants on the news. I think that the U.S. has a role to play both in supporting independent media in this part of the world, investigative journalism. This is how one has accountability and more connectivity, right, between populations and their leadership. And I think when we are absent, it is, again, just incredibly easy to caricature the U.S. as uninterested or worse, having some kind of malign interest in the region. And I've been looking at African social media discussions pretty intently for several years as part of a book project. And, the Russians, they too have their own influence campaigns that are very, very popular. And the messages are, you can see why the messages would be appealing. The messages are about respect for African lives and sovereignty. They're about addressing the frustration that African countries are rich in resources and yet people can't find jobs. Having an absence of both straight reporting and clear messaging about what the U.S. is trying to achieve, there's then just a vacuum. And there we are with adversaries quite busily filling it.
Thank you. Mr. Meservey?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, I would like to see American embassies be more proactive in this space, coordinating their messaging, or maybe receiving messaging from Washington. I don't know exactly how it would look, but there are moments in the geopolitical calendar where there are real opportunities for the U.S. to push out a message that is positive about the United States. But there's traditionally been a reticence, or even in some cases I would describe it as almost an embarrassment in some cases, to take a really vigorous, pro-American, unapologetic stance on the U.S., whereas the Russias and Irans and Chinas of the world have no problems at all doing that type of thing. They don't spend their time, worried about injustices from the past that they might have been involved in. So I think that's one area. Another area that always frustrated me was we had these extraordinary programs, PEPFAR being one of them, that literally saved tens of millions of African lives.
Past tense.
I'm hopeful that there will be elements of that continuing, but I understand that's an ongoing process. But as far as I could tell, we got very little credit for that. And now that's not the only reason to do something, but because this program was funded by American taxpayers, it should have redounded to American taxpayer credit. But the U.S. was just very bad about reminding people of the extraordinary benefits that came from American public health interventions. It was very bad about tooting its own horn, let's say. So I think we need to move away from that reticence and, again, be much more coordinated and even aggressive in touting the American model and demonstrating our track record.
And I certainly agree with that in terms of being very clear about what we're providing to help in countries. I think the sad thing at this point is we don't have those programs anymore because they're gone. They just got eliminated. And so how do we do that? And how do we do that? I agree with you on the embassies. I think our embassies ought to be very positive about the United States and what we offer to countries. But without an apparatus to get that messaging out, it's going to be really hard to do that, especially when we're up against over $1 billion from the PRC in providing that kind of information. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Good point, both of you, on the fact that we didn't get any credit for PEPFAR. I think probably the reason for that was we didn't do this to get credit. We did this to actually make a difference, and we made a difference. And I think we'll continue to do so as we go through these programs. But I think that's probably a lesson for us, that when you do good, you ought to at least give yourself credit for doing good. And we just did the good and didn't take any credit for it. So, Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of attention has been given to the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea and its impact on global shipping. However, there's a deeper, more strategic, critical problem developing here with regard to the Houthis funding from Iran, and they're moving into Somalia and establishing relationship ties with al-Shabaab and the Islamic State's Somalia. And this is something that I think is very challenging for the United States. During the first Trump administration, Trump's maximum pressure effort brought Iran's foreign reserves down from over $122.5 billion to under $14 billion. And I'm pleased to see that the Trump administration is again putting maximum pressure on Iran to cut off the flow of money from Iran to terrorist groups like the Houthis. I think that needs to happen to be able to make sure we're putting pressure on them. We also need to get the snapback sanctions on Iran as well. But this growing pipeline of drones, munitions, and military expertise risks turning the Horn of Africa into an extension of Iran's proxy network. If left unchecked, this could destabilize the region, the shipping lanes, embolden the Islamic insurgents, and create a multi-front threat to the U.S. and our interests in the Horn of Africa. Mr. Meservey, how urgent is this risk that the Houthis are moving into Somalia? Is this a long-term problem? Can you talk a little bit about what you see right now and how urgent that is?
Yeah, thank you, Senator, for the question. As you laid out, it is a very real problem. The Kenyans would say it's maybe their primary national security threat is the prospect of al-Shabaab getting advanced drones, for instance, from the Houthis, or just getting more advanced capabilities. There's a long history of al-Shabaab receiving help from AQAP, which was al-Qaeda's affiliate in Yemen. So those routes are well established, and there's also people constantly moving back and forth. So it's highly plausible, even though the Houthis are a Shia operation and al-Shabaab is a Sunni one. They can be quite ecumenical when they're focused on attacking the United States or other adversaries. So yeah, it's a very serious concern. I haven't seen in the open source any sort of definitive account of exactly what the exchanges look like. But certainly if it starts to include things like drones or even capabilities around IEDs, then that would be a massive problem, both within Somalia, but also including neighboring states like Kenya, like Ethiopia, potentially even Djibouti.
What should the U.S. Congress do to help be preventive to make sure that the Horn of Africa doesn't become the next step in Iran's proxy network against us?
I think you referenced this maximum pressure campaign. I think Congress should do all that it can to assist such a campaign and remind the administration that the problem extends far beyond Iran, far beyond the Middle East. It also extends into places like Africa. The Houthi al-Shabaab links are not the only Iranian presence on the continent. There's a long history of Hezbollah receiving funding, especially from West Africa, but actually all across the continent. Shia proselytization and other Iranian activity. I referenced some of the increased recent Iranian activity in my remarks. So Africa should absolutely be part of this maximum pressure campaign, and I think Congress can help the administration do that.
Now, I'm running out of time here, so I want to just switch a little bit to talk about Communist China and their influence on Africa, which we've already discussed a little bit. But one of the things that Communist China is doing is establish a training school in Tanzania. And essentially what they're doing is training the people who are interested in politics about authoritarianism, as the chairman was pointing out, and really working against multi-party democracy. What, again, should we as the U.S. Congress be doing to help push back on what Communist China is doing in East Africa with regard to how they're trying to undermine the democracies there?
So yes, it's China has a whole of government, to use that cliche approach, to undermining democratic norms on the continent. They're very pragmatic. They'll work with any type of government, but they are quite explicitly pushing their own model and saying, look, you can enjoy economic prosperity as well as centralized power, even authoritarian power. So regarding the training school that you referenced, this is the CCP has long links to the liberation movements in Southern Africa, especially, and there are constant trainings ongoing between CCP and liberation movement cadres in ANC in South Africa. Their entire NEC, their governing council, has been trained in China. So I think the U.S. Needs to try a variety of approaches. One, again, it needs to unabashedly make the case for democracy, free markets, et cetera. I think it should hearken back to the history the United States has of partnering with countries like Japan, like South Korea, for instance, Germany after World War II, and demonstrate that with strong American partnership, you can really achieve significant gains. I think it should focus heavily on supporting civil society organizations, which are oftentimes the best check on overweening government power, et cetera.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, if I may just have it, can I allow Ambassador Gavin to maybe weigh in on that last question real briefly? Is that okay?
Generous as the chairman is.
You are so generous. Thank you. Ambassador Gavin, could you just quickly, again, just kind of highlight, and don't repeat what Mr. Meservey said, but anything else you'd observe?
Yes, I think that this relationship between the CCP and these dominant ruling parties on the continent is actually ultimately going to be a disadvantage for China, because the sort of discourse about why these ruling parties should be in charge tends to link back to liberation, and most African societies skew very young. These are populations that don't remember pre-liberation days and are wondering what their government has done for them lately. So I think, continuing to hold, it would be nice to restore some of the democracy and governance work that the U.S. did, NDI and IRI, that help really draw a clear line between party and state, which is also important for combating corruption, which if you look at Afrobarometer polling is at the very top of African priority lists. So we can align ourselves with these populations that way.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Coons.
Thank you very much, Chairman Risch, Ranking Member Shaheen, for this important full committee hearing, and to the Ambassador and to Mr. Meservey, thank you for your testimony. What I hear from both of you is more engagement, not less. More of what we have done that works, and that the abrupt and chaotic closure of a very wide range of our most effective tools for engaging with Africa, from the MCC to YALI to the PEPFAR program, puts all of this at risk. Mr. Chairman, if I might, given your opening comments in the exchange, I'd love to work with you on clarifying the U.S.-Kenya relationship. Their foreign minister and national security advisor were just here last week meeting with the president and folks at the White House, and I agree with you that some of those statements with the PRC are very concerning given the deep and long relationship and the security relationship we have with regards to al-Shabaab in Somalia.
It's disappointing, to say the least.
You referenced how important it is that there be more students from Africa coming to the United States. Well, I've got a solution for you. It's a 15-year-old program called the Young African Leaders Initiative that has sent 20,000 vetted, promising African students to the United States. The University of Delaware happens to be one of the 20 hosting universities at a very modest cost that is about to be shut down. Not a good idea. It brings promising young African leaders to the United States for a summer to meet with businesses and entrepreneurs, to meet with civil society, to convene in Washington, and then go to 20 different states all over the country. One of many things I don't think we should shut down. To the point you just made, Ambassador Gavin, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC, launched under President Bush, explicitly used corruption and combating corruption, reducing corruption as one of the key indicators for whether or not a country would get a long-term development partnership with the United States. It is all but closed. Most of its staff have been laid off. Many of its compacts have been shut down. PEPFAR, Mr. Meservey, is all but closed. It has been trimmed dramatically from its scope. A 25-year-old program, long deserving of bipartisan support. I'd just be interested in both of you briefly saying, what does it do to our reputation on a continent of 54 countries, a continent with enormous human potential and natural resources, a country that China and Russia see as the continent of the 21st century? What's it do to our place in East Africa and across the continent if we abruptly shut down these long-standing, demonstrated, and effective programs? Madam Ambassador, and then Mr. Meservey.
Thank you, Senator. It is incredibly self-defeating, is my view. I just don't understand why we are taking a bunch of tools in our foreign policy toolbox and tossing them into a dumpster.
I think the term was a wood chipper.
Okay, I suppose so.
It's tougher to reassemble things that have been put through a wood chipper than things that have gone through a reasoned, considerable review, which is the process that we should have gone through, is to have this body, Congress, work with the new administration to say, okay, trim this, reform this, change this, shutter this, expand this. Yeah. That's not what happened.
No, it's not. And not only have we lit our credibility on fire, and you see particularly China making hay of this, the favorite phrase now is reliable partner. China's a reliable partner. They're not going to abruptly pull the rug out from under you. And I think that, some of the kind of knock-on effects, consider tens of thousands of health workers in Kenya who are out of work now. These are educated, engaged citizens, and the messaging we want to do about this long relationship with Kenya, it's at odds with their lived experience now. And
I'm about out of time. I've got less than a minute.
Sorry.
Mr. Meservey, if I might. I do agree that a bright spot is the hard work done under the previous administration by Avril Haines in DRC, Rwanda, and it's continuing under Special Advisor Boulos. There's a real chance of peace there. I can't think of a more concentrated example of the PRC-US competition than the two adjacent bases in Djibouti. I've just introduced with Senator Ricketts a bill to try and prioritize focusing on denying the PRC more basing opportunities on the continent. What do you think we ought to make a priority in doing that important work?
Yeah, thank you, Senator, and I'm very pleased to hear about the bill and your attention to this problem. I would especially highlight the danger of an Atlantic Ocean base. We know quite reliably that China has been pursuing such a base for years. It's not hard to see how problematic that would be for security of the American homeland. So I think I mentioned in my original remarks that commercial engagement should be at the heart of a strategy. And I think we need to start giving African countries more of what they want and less of what they don't. That seems like an obvious proposition, but frequently our Africa strategy doesn't seem to be guided by that principle. So the existential crisis that every African government faces is youth unemployment. Yep. And our development assistance and humanitarian assistance, as useful as that is in some contexts, is not going to address those problems. So I think
I do think that the Development Finance Corporation and the MCC really focused on private sector partnerships that fuel growth from the bottom up. I think to the extent we can focus our messaging, our investments, and our partnerships on combating corruption, on being a secure and reliable partner, and on helping create reliable, high-growth jobs, this continent of 4 billion people by the end of this century is a place where we can win in the competition with China. And if we don't, if we continue our retreat, we won't. Thank you both.
agreed.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Senator Cornyn.
Thank you for being here. I think we all agree that Africa is an important place, and that we are not doing everything that we should do or might do in order to influence the direction of that continent. I do take exception to some of my colleagues' statements about the previous, let's say, the status quo ante, with a lot of money being spent in disjointed, wasteful, and unfocused ways by the federal government. And obviously changing that is disruptive, and there's a lot of programs that I think, particularly PEPFAR, which have been particularly important in Africa in terms of our soft power and saving lives. And so I continue, obviously, to support that. But it seems to me we lack a coherent strategy. And I'm not sure that, I know the administration is working on some targeted projects, for example, the DRC on the critical minerals front and others. But my visit to Kenya, Angola, and the DRC last August, I was struck just by not only the magnitude of the challenge, but how we seem to lack any particular strategy to deal with making it any different than it is now. So maybe both of you, if take it in turn, please. What would be a successful regional strategy in East Africa look like for the United States? That doesn't necessarily have to all emanate from the White House. Congress can begin that conversation. What would that look like?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I think it's important first to ensure that any regional strategy is integrated into a broader continental strategy and then global strategy. But as far as the region specifically, the U.S. needs to determine exactly what its interests are, what its goals are, and how it can get there. That all seems obvious.
That
but
seems pretty fundamental.
yeah, but
I mean,
sometimes
one of the things where our goal would be to stop the Russians and the Chinese from essentially preempting us and pushing us out in terms of our influence. But go ahead.
Yes, absolutely. So I referenced the potential Russian base really in Port Sudan. That would be massively problematic. We already have the Chinese base in Djibouti, as we've discussed. So I think, again, I'm a big believer in commercial engagement. I think the U.S. government and the U.S. Congress can help streamline the work of organizations like the DFC and Exim Bank, make them more fit for purpose. They're too slow, they're too bureaucratic. And then make that really this commercial engagement the centerpiece of the value proposition that the United States brings to these countries. I also think it should determine which countries it can actually achieve things with. There are just some some governments on the continent that are so hostile and so frankly inept that it's very hard to determine how the U.S. could ever actually achieve much of anything with them. I would, some specific areas you could talk about critical minerals. EAC does have such things. I know that critical minerals is already a cliche to talk about, but it is a reality for the United States and Africa.
It's not just a cliche, right?
Yeah, it's a real thing. There's a reason everybody talks about it. So Africa will have to be part of the solution for the United States. The U.S. needs to figure out how to support its companies. It should work with the companies of allied countries because we have very few mining companies anymore in this country. So, but the Australians, the Canadians, they have huge mining companies and look for possibilities there. They should also work closely with other allied countries on financing arrangements and take a much more systematic and harmonized approach with allies to these regions to focus on the core interests of the United States, which again would be security and then some of these economic issues.
Ambassador?
Thank you. I think, particularly for the Horn, it is really important to integrate what we're trying to accomplish in Africa with a strategy that looks at the other side of the Red Sea. So this is broadly, what we need to do is stop treating Africa like an extra credit project in foreign policy and make it part of the core curriculum and integrate it into the way we think about achieving U.S. interests globally. And I think that, more engagement, as Senator Coons said, a focus on peace and conflict prevention, because the conflicts in Africa provide opportunities, particularly to Russia and to various criminal networks, terrorist and otherwise, that this is not in our interest. Commercial deals, yes, but making sure that deals don't just benefit a set of elites at the top, but are deals that we can talk about benefiting both sides of the Atlantic in a way that addresses some of these job creation issues.
I see my time is up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for your helpful testimony. I want to return to the chairman's opening comments where he introduced an article into the record and talked about the recent discussion of the Kenyan president in China about this new world order. Let me read from an article that I'd like introduced in the record. Kenya calls for a new world order that reflects global South realities, and this is from KBC Digital, the Kenya Broadcasting Company, if I could introduce it into the record. From April 23, just recently. Speaking during a public lecture at Peking University in Beijing, President William Ruto emphasized the need to fashion a new world order which takes cognizance of present realities. The president, who is in China for a state visit, okay, China is welcoming the Kenyan president for a state visit, said this: the ongoing trade tariff wars could signal the end of the old world order as it has existed since the end of World War II. And further, regarding the relationship between Kenya, China, and the rest of the world, Ruto remarked that Kenya and China are not just trade partners, but, quote, co-architects of a new world order. So his comments are putting the U.S. in the old world order that has not helped the global South. This is what he is asserting, whether or not it's true, how true it is. He's suggesting that the trade wars might be the destruction of the old world order, and the creation of a new world order where China and Kenya and other nations focus more attention on the global south. How do we get to a place where the president of Kenya, where we've had this long relationship just 2 weeks ago, is making those assertions in the middle of a state visit to China? I do think comments that have been made by my colleagues, the recent apparent abandonment of PEPFAR, the defunding of USAID, NED, the DFC, the MCC, the YALI program, which also has a presence at the University of Virginia. AFRICOM is not based in Africa and has perennially been under-resourced. It's based in Germany. Picking a fight with South Africa, a pretty important nation, and labeling them as committing genocide against Afrikaan farmers. Accepting Afrikaner refugees while we're shutting off other refugees from Africa. Mr. Meservey, you used to work with Church World Service. Church World Service work on refugee issues has been dramatically curtailed. The church I go to is heavily Congolese refugees who have been resettled in Richmond by Catholic Refugee Service. Their work has been curtailed. You know, we don't get the benefit of the doubt necessarily, and people look at evidence and they interpret it as to what it means. And what they're interpreting, the evidence that I've cited and other bits of evidence, is that the U.S. is, you know, to put it charitably, uninterested, and to put it not so charitably, affirmatively disinterested. And that leads a president like President Ruto to make those kinds of comments, almost gleefully hoping that Donald Trump's tariff war will destroy the world order that the U.S. created in the aftermath of World War II to the benefit not only of the United States, but other nations all over the world. We've got to reverse this. We have to reverse it. And I hear this all over Latin America as I travel there. We'd rather deal with you than with China. I think in the Americas there's even a closer cultural connection because of migration patterns and family ties, but there are with Africa as well. We'd rather deal with you than China, but you got to have something on the table. And China does, and they're not going anywhere. And yeah, the conditions may be bad, and yeah, there are strings attached, and yeah, they may not perform, but they got something on the table. What do you have on the table? The things we've had on the table are being hollowed out. And you know, we can wring our hands about this all we want in this committee, but if we keep wringing out the architecture of the relationships with Africa or other parts of the world, China's got stuff on the table. They're going to continue to. I don't know so much about Russia or Iran. Their staying power. China's going to have staying power. I wanted to ask you, Ambassador Gavin, one question, and you were getting to it sort of at the end of the Q&A with Senator Cornyn. I thought it was intriguing in your comments, your opening comments about, hey, let's look at East Africa in connection with Yemen. You know, we divide CENTCOM from AFRICOM. We divide in this committee, you know, Africa from the MENA region. Talk a little bit about what a coordinated Red Sea strategy might look like.
Sure. Well, I think that it would require convening both the African side of the Red Sea and the powers there with these Gulf actors who are clearly intervening to try and stake out influence and territory and trying to tease out what exactly are the core security concerns that these actors are worried about and what is a more opportunistic approach. And, you know, ultimately, these two regions are going to need to build an institutional security architecture, and we can assist with that. But our own thinking about U.S. security in the Red Sea, in the Bab el-Mandeb, and the Gulf of Aden, we need to be thinking much more holistically and bringing the expertise from our different communities to bear. And I do really recommend USIP's work on this. They've been doing incredibly important work on this issue for a long time.
I yield back. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. There's nothing to yield back, Senator. I guess you're right. I'll be delighted.
I'll yield some back next time.
I'll put that on the record for next time. Senator McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Thank you both for being here today. Mr. Meservey, I understand you're a Pennsylvanian, so it's good to have you here today. I want to start with just a word on PEPFAR. So I've been a long supporter of the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which was created when I served during the Bush administration. By some estimates, that program has saved 26 million lives in just over 20 years. So my question to you is really twofold. Number one, how does that program advance U.S. national security interest? And second, some countries in Africa have started to move to their own versions of that program. What is the path to self-reliance and self-sufficiency for that program?
Yeah, thank you, Senator, and greetings from your home state. I'll take the last one first. So one of the problems that we had with PEPFAR, even though it was tremendously successful, and was that some host governments were not taking the ownership that they needed to. It was never supposed to be an open-ended program. And so I think that I hope that elements of this are reconstituted. I genuinely do. Public health interventions have been successful on their own merits. If it is reconstituted, I think there needs to be a very clear roadmap for receiving countries to take ownership. It needs to be thoughtful and reasonable, of course, but one of the dangers of long-running aid programs is that eventually they just become an entitlement that countries just receive as a matter of fact and don't take ownership for. So that would be one thing. Regarding, and then I think probably with some countries, you need to do an assessment of, do they all need PEPFAR anymore? Which ones really need it? Which ones are at greatest risk? I lived in Zambia at the height of the HIV pandemic, and that was it was a focus country for very good reason. So, we need to continue those types of assessments. And then how does PEPFAR help national security interests? Well, one, it does contribute to soft power. It's very hard to quantify, and I think we weren't good enough about getting as much soft power as we should have from PEPFAR, but I think it's also undeniable that it did help us in that respect. But also, mass death in a society is fundamentally destabilizing, and it prevented mass death in some cases, and it allowed for a much higher quality of life for millions of people, even beyond the lives at sea. So
stabilizing, yeah. Thank you. And I just want to reiterate, as someone who's a big supporter of the program, the initial vision at creation was never that it was perpetual. There was a transition to self-sufficiency. So thank you for that. And Ambassador, thank you for being here. We read and hear a lot about the Belt and Road Initiative and growing influence of China in Africa and expanding security assistance. What challenge do those activities pose to U.S. counterterrorism efforts? And in particular, what would you suggest the United States be doing to ensure that in light of that investment on the part of the Chinese, that we're evolving our counterterrorism efforts to be as effective as possible?
Well, thank you. I think the Belt and Road investments, certainly some of the digital Belt and Road investments raise questions, make it difficult for us to engage in intelligence cooperation with some of these partners because of concerns about Chinese access. But some of the infrastructure investments, quite frankly, redound to our benefit too, right? We are driving on the same road that they built, and that can help us get some things done. So I just want to flag that China's not going to leave Africa, not ever. And so learning how to compete effectively will require recognition that African governments are not going to reject all Chinese investment in trade. It's their largest trading partner, et cetera. But on counterterrorism, I think that it's really about influence, trust, the kind of relationships with security establishments that enable meaningful cooperation in any security space. And China's working very hard on establishing those kinds of relationships. Again, I think that the U.S. potentially has an advantage if we can work more institutionally rather than personally because of churn and turnover.
To the chairman's point, yeah. Mr. Chairman, I yield as well.
I'll take it. Thank you so much. I have on this side, in order of appearance, Senator Rosen, Senator Van Hollen, Senator Booker. I know it seems like you were here, but they actually were here before you left and came back. So under the rules, sorry about that. Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Chairman Risch, Ranking Member Shaheen. Thank you to the witnesses for your work and for your willingness to serve. I'm going to talk a little bit about Somalia first, and a lot of extremist problems there, because over the past year, ISIS Somalia has emerged as a key player in the Islamic State global financial and operational network. It's facilitating the movement of money, foreign fighters, and military trainers to Islamic State affiliates throughout Africa and beyond. ISIS Somalia just doesn't pose a threat to U.S. forces and our partners in the region. Their aggressive efforts to plan and conduct external operations are a threat to U.S. citizens everywhere. U.S. forces have taken action to degrade ISIS Somalia's capability, but there's more that must be done. So, Ambassador, during the last Trump administration, the President withdrew almost all the U.S. troops from Somalia. What would be the consequences of the administration doing that again now?
I think the consequences would be incredibly dangerous. The situation has evolved even from that period of the first Trump administration, and we do have, two different terrorist organizations that wish us harm and have a track record of being able to carry out attacks at some distance. I am sympathetic to the argument that I know my colleague will make, that it's very frustrating to have been continuing to try to build Somali capacity to combat these threats themselves year after year after year, only to have these efforts essentially undermined by poor governance in Somalia. But the question is, what is the alternative? Mm-hmm. Being frustrated and sort of washing our hands of it doesn't address these very, very real threats.
Let me ask you this then. Research has shown that violent extremism surges during humanitarian crises, and you talk about not good governance and those things. So how are the Islamic insurgents in Somalia taking advantage of these issues to recruit? And what does the administration's, our cuts to humanitarian aid compound this to what you were just mentioning?
Certainly it does feed right into the messaging about who the enemy is, but it also creates the kind of resource scarcity that leads to desperation, people seizing, who might not really be ideologically aligned, but are looking to survive. And so there's you have to sift through these groups in Somalia. Some of it is survival. Some of it is sort of hardcore believers. Some of it is Somali nationalism. Mm-hmm. But it's certainly not helping. It's hurting.
Thank you. I want to stay on Africa for a minute because, Ambassador Gavin, again, this is a difficult period for everyone residing in East Africa and the Horn. I want to talk about women's role there. We know it's particularly hard for women and for girls. The war in Sudan, extremism in Somalia, the post-conflict reconstruction in Ethiopia. They have left thousands of women survivors of conflict-related sexual violence struggling for justice. Across the region, women continue to battle forced marriages, child labor, lack of social protections, and murder just for being a woman. They struggle to break through economically, politically, and through any social norms to gain equality. So, Ambassador, could you talk about how the U.S. has supported women's and girls' advancements in East Africa and the Horn, and really the importance of doing so, and again, the impact of U.S. terminating these kinds of programs on the region and success of the region? I think women can support of the family. So is it really critical to family structure and stability in some ways, right?
It's, of course, it's essential. And in many African societies, women are a backbone, of course, of what what creates peace and stability. And you're right about the really jaw-dropping and appalling level of sexual violence that we're seeing associated with the conflicts in the Horn right now. This happened in Tigray during that crisis. It's happening in the Amhara and Oromo areas right now. And of course, Sudan's plight is heartbreaking. And when the U.S. is not there to try and provide assistance, medical assistance, and support, and critically a voice speaking out about some international norms, I think we all are invested
Violence
in.
against women, right?
Then we're missing a chance to strengthen these societies that we would like to have as peaceful partners going forward.
Thank you. And I, too, will follow the norm and yield back.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. I don't mean this disrespectfully, but your criticism about pulling troops out of that area, I think it's important for the record to note that when you have troops there, the question always is who are you going to train and who are you going to fight with? And when you have Somalia, Puntland, Somaliland, all of whom have disputed borders and incredibly entangled tribal issues there, who do you stand with? Now, obviously, we fight ISIS there and we fight Houthis there. If we can identify them, okay. But boy, the rest of this stuff, this is really a tough question. So I appreciate the criticism, but there's a lot more to this than just here are the good guys and here are the bad guys. Finding good guys is really, really difficult there. So, but anyway, thank you for your thoughts. With that, we'll turn to Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank both of you for your testimony today. I'm actually going to pick up where Senator Rosen left off with respect to Sudan. We're now in the third year of a brutal civil war in Sudan. When Secretary Rubio was here for his confirmation hearing, he testified that helping resolve that conflict would be a top priority of the administration. Clearly, that has not happened. In fact, the cuts to U.S. humanitarian assistance have made a desperate situation in Sudan even worse. Ambassador Gavin, you wrote a piece for the Council for Foreign Relations, I think back in February, entitled The Abandonment of Sudan. Obviously, we need to look for ways to put pressure on some of the outside parties. I have proposed actually stopping U.S. military assistance to the UAE so long as it continues to support the murderous RSF. And I think I heard you say, Mr. Meservey, that the RSF could not continue its military operations without that outside help from the UAE. But if I could start with you, Ambassador Gavin, what should we do, and should we be using more of our leverage to put pressure on some of the outside parties that are fueling this murderous conflict, including the UAE support for the RSF?
Yes, I absolutely think we should be using more of our leverage with the UAE and having real conversations. I think Emirati officials are aware that the RSF is never going to govern all of Sudan. They have concerns about what the other side of the coin looks like. And so do we, frankly, or we should. And what we've called the SAF for a long time is a coalition of entities and actors, some of which are highly problematic in terms of U.S. interests. And I don't think that is likely to hold together in a scenario where there could be a military solution. But the reality is there is no military solution. What needs to happen is a set of talks that involve Sudanese actors, pressure on these external actors who continue to arm and fuel both antagonists, but most importantly, really a greater effort to elevate the civilian voices in Sudan who have never given up. They continue to be, in many parts of the country, the only source of medical care, of food, which is quite scarce. And they have been organizing to try to come up with some clear principles they would like all parties to agree to. That needs to be raised up and given validation and credibility from the U.S.
Thank you. Given the time, I'm going to turn briefly now to Ethiopia
and Eritrea. I think we all know that Ethiopia stands at a pretty critical juncture as it grapples with the aftermath of the conflict in Tigray. And as we speak, we see, Eritrea, I think the leader there called up the troops, at least there are reports to that effect. I guess my question for each of you is, if you were in charge right now of U.S. policy, what practical steps would you take today to try to address the bubbling, really almost boiling situation with respect to Ethiopia and Eritrea? Why don't we start with you, Mr. Meservey?
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a few key issues here. One is that the Eritreans are still inside of Ethiopian territory in western Tigray, in violation of the Pretoria Agreement, which is what ended the Tigray War, ostensibly. So there has to be a process for having them leave, but of course their presence is also tied into the internal divisions where the Amhara claim that area, the Tigrayans also claim it. It's a major flashpoint. So I think right now what the U.S. can do, and I believe what it did do along with other partner countries, was to unequivocally demonstrate to both sides that we are watching and that a conflict would be unacceptable. And then it should offer its good offices for either convening discussions or trying to mediate around some of these issues, but they are intensely difficult, and I'm not, frankly, terribly positive about the immediate prospects for resolving them.
Thank you. Pastor Gavin.
I would just quickly agree and add that, mobilizing more of the AU member states to insist on actual implementation of the Pretoria Agreement would be a helpful focal point. This is something everybody's already agreed to, but it has not been fully implemented. It's in this strange limbo. And so I think that getting that kind of regional engagement would be helpful.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Senator Cruz.
Thank you. Mr. Meservey, as we've been discussing, I believe the Chinese Communist Party presents the most significant long-term strategic threat to the United States. I also believe that China is a global threat that has to be confronted globally, including in Africa. We have a vast range of interests in Africa and a complicated security architecture. Our interests there are counterterrorism, trade in critical mineral supply lines, global biosecurity, preventing illegal immigration that threatens allies in other parts of the world, blocking illicit finance of hostile actors, and even, importantly, space development. And across Africa, again and again, the Chinese have exploited local political, economic, and sometimes even cultural conditions to undermine American national security interests. Sometimes they do it by securing bilateral and multilateral agreements that block American goals. Other times they do it by creating instability, but they are actively doing it. Talk a little bit about the specific tactics that China is using in East Africa and the Horn, and what are the specific conditions they are exploiting?
Yeah, thank you, Senator, for the question. China, first of all, has a long-standing strategy for the continent. That's been a topic of this conversation, is the U.S. doesn't have anything comparable. And they are highly disciplined about implementing it. So that's sort of the foundation of what they're doing. As far as specific tactics, they like to engage at a very senior level, the highest possible senior level. They do that in a variety of ways. Some of it is as open as bribery, but a lot of it is helping leaders, for instance, with key infrastructure projects that helps them politically in the domestic space, or just expressing solidarity. That rhetoric is important. But even the diplomatic exchanges, they engage, as I said, at a very high level, but they do it constantly. as well. I referenced in my opening remarks over 100 visits from senior Chinese officials to this area. So they engage at a much higher tempo and at a much more senior level than U.S. Diplomats do. So those are some of the specific tactics that they use, but they're not unique to East Africa. They use them across the continent to great effect. And then easy money loans, very important to their strategy, investment, trade agreements. We're seeing more and more free trade agreements where these so-called green lanes, where they're preferential access to the Chinese market for agricultural goods. So it's genuinely a wide array of tactics that are grounded in a long-term strategy.
And how has Chinese involvement impacted the ongoing conflicts in the region?
Yeah, so I think usually China actually prefers stability because that facilitates what they're trying to do in other areas. They generally try to stay out of these types of things. We have seen some sort of, I would argue, weak diplomatic efforts from the Chinese. They do have a special envoy for the region who occasionally goes and talks to the various leaders, but I don't think anything substantive comes of it. And they do contribute to peacekeeping operations, but that's much more, I would argue, about them building both diplomatic heft, but also capabilities for and experience for the troops in these types of austere environments where they're often put. So I think they are not nearly as helpful as they could be. I think where they actively are negative are the Chinese weapons that flow through the area. Back in the original Sudan civil war, they armed the Omar al-Bashir regime, which was genociding Darfuris at the time. They armed both Ethiopia and Eritrea during their border war in the late 1990s. And Chinese weapons continue to flood the area. We're seeing Chinese bombs and other things, probably re-exported from UAE, show up in Sudan.
So many of the agreements China has been locking in are explicitly military agreements. Since 2017, China has operated a military base in Djibouti. The CCP Beijing is actively working to deepen ties across the region to secure greater access to the Red Sea and key maritime routes. Describe the nature of China's specifically military cooperation in the Horn.
Yeah, so you referenced the flagship, which is the Djibouti base, but we have seen a very real uptick in military trainings. So I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, the Chinese inaugurated an annual meeting for African defense chiefs. They convene in Beijing. And that has been ongoing, I believe, for 3 years, if I remember correctly. I also referenced in my written testimony the fact that PLA Navy vessels participate in these anti-piracy task forces in the Gulf of Aden. They then will go all around the continent doing port calls, both on the Indian Ocean, but also the Atlantic Ocean side. That's clearly an effort to build blue water naval capabilities that they covet so they can project power into the South China Sea and probably for an eventual invasion of Taiwan. And again, the weapons, so weapons training, deployments, and I already referenced the peacekeeping operations. I would say those are the primary elements.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. Senator Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to start by adding to, I think, some of the sentiments expressed that we have a colossal problem right now by our failing to understand that if you look at all of humanity, the future is in so many ways Africa. We have 1 out of every 4 people on the planet Earth, and by 2050 are going to be on the continent. 1 out of every 3 working age people. The continent is indispensable when it comes to the future strength, opportunities, prosperity, health of Americans. It is stunning to me that we are lacking a vision for engagement with the continent and are making such colossal mistakes. What the Trump administration is doing right now is not only unacceptable, but it is a series of self-inflicted wounds when we cut the kind of programs that have created economic stability and opportunity for American companies, that have gutted public health and our response to public health, because a public health crisis anywhere now is a threat to public health everywhere. We are stopping, especially as we see the Tanzania elections and the Uganda elections and the instabilities there, we're cutting back our resources helping with democratic stability at a time that democracies are under retreat all across the globe, and the democratic freedoms and ideals that we preach are being undermined by forces that don't share our values. We are in a state of crisis right now when it comes to our relations with the continent and other competitors of ours, from Iranians to Russians to Chinese to people that don't always align with us, from the Emiratis and others, are flooding the zone where we are retreating in a stunning way. We are seeing our retreat on public health, on economic empowerment, on national security, and creating a more volatile and dangerous environment where there are forces there that want to see the destruction of America. And there's no place that, to me, that this is more obvious than just this retreat we have, even in where our embassies and consulates that this administration is slating to close. China has embassies in every single country, and we now see a list that consulates and embassies all over the world, but 6 embassies and 2 consulates in Africa, including around the Horn, are being shut down. When I travel through Africa, the power of our presence there, our ability to combat misinformation and propaganda, our ability to create deep partnerships and connection, we are truly pursuing a set of policies that are going to undermine America's safety, security, and economic strength in the future and make us be more targeted by forces from the Red Sea all the way to terrorist attacks here at home based upon the instability and folks who are focusing and targeting and trying to undermine America. And so, I am stunned. I've already been upset in past administrations with our failure to prioritize. But what's happening right now is just utterly stunning, and generations of Americans will pay a price for it unless we find a way, in a bipartisan way, to focus and do more. In my scarce remaining time, I just want to focus in on Sudan. You call it, Ambassador, rightfully, the worst humanitarian crisis on the globe. And if you want to talk about ethnic cleansing, as the administration rolls out the red carpet for some South Africans recently, the horrors of what's going on there, the instability it's causing to South Sudan, to Chad, the threat to the Horn in general, it cannot be overstated. And so if you, in the time that you have before me, can you please help us as a committee understand that the failure of American focus, there was a bipartisan letter we just put forward to get a special envoy. Just the failure of Americans to focus on this is not only contributing to greater humanitarian crises, but creating a level of instability and crisis that advantages forces that we are opposing, like the Chinese and the Russians and more.
I can take a stab at it. You're absolutely right. Russia thrives in environments of chaos where they can cut a deal to do regime security, whether the regime is legitimate or not, and get access to resources. But Sudan's problem is bigger than Sudan. My concern is that we're going to end up with this belt of metastasizing instability all the way across the continent, from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. You have the crisis in the Sahel. Things are not looking great in Central Africa, although I'm hopeful that some advances will bear fruit. And then you have what's happening in the Horn. And as these conflicts spill over, they relate to each other, and it gets harder and harder to disentangle the threads, right? It's hard enough to make peace with 2 or 3 parties. Trying to do it with 16 is a very, very tall order. So I agree with you. I think that, a de facto partition does not mean stability. These are fractious armed entities on either side, and it's, I think important always to remember that Osama bin Laden used to operate from Sudan. The Islamist forces that are a part of that Port Sudan coalition have a long history of wishing America harm.
Mr. Chairman, before I yield, there's a staggering moral failure here in our ability to exercise American influence, greater American influence on this crisis. But what's worse than this is I fear that if we aren't successful in addressing the abject lack of attention, focus, and energy from a diplomatic perspective, that this crisis will grow worse and have implications on our own national security, as our witness indicated. And I'm hoping that we as a committee can take even more actions to try to get the Trump administration to give a higher priority to solving this crisis and showing some true American leadership.
Yeah. Senator, my partner here and I made the decision to hold this hearing for the reasons you've indicated. There's serious problems here. And as you indicated, or as has been suggested, everything has to be prioritized. And the difficulty is, as always, it's a question of money. You know, going into debt, $1 trillion every 150 days is unsustainable. So where do you put the money? And there are things here that absolutely cry out for our attention. And the other fact that I think has been underscored here again and again and again is that Africa is such a galloping influence on the planet that it really does need our attention, particularly when it's getting such close attention by people who have values that are very different than ours, other than democracy and respect for human rights. So that's the purpose of the hearing.
Mr. Chairman, the one thing that I would request, and I have a feeling that the Trump administration will listen to you more than me, this does not cost any money to simply nominate ambassadors to key countries in Africa. There's been a scarce lack of even them coming forward with putting up leaders, as we see them filling posts from European nations and others. But in critical areas, we're not even getting ambassadorial nominees.
Fair point. We get that. But again, this comes back to there's only so many hours in a day. And as you know, moving ambassadors through here is without regard to the politics, moving ambassadors through here is a very cumbersome job that the Founding Fathers handed us with the system we go through. But thank you for your thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Shaheen.
I know we're out of time, but I would like to just make 2 points. One is apropos the earlier conversation about PEPFAR and it not being an entitlement. I would like to point out that multiple African countries have, in fact, increased their financing to help pay for PEPFAR and to address HIV/AIDS. And so I would hope that we would continue to help work in partnership with them on that issue. The other thing I would point out with respect to Sudan, one of the things that we know from the data is that when women are at the table in negotiations, that those negotiations are more likely to last longer term and more likely to be successful. It's a mistake we made in Afghanistan when we totally left women out of those negotiations for conflict, and it's the reason why I have been so supportive of the women, peace, and security legislation that we passed, that President Trump signed in his first term, and that now has decided to get rid of because he thinks it's a DEI program. It is not a DEI program. It is a program that recognizes that women make up half of the world, and they need to be part of negotiations and part of ongoing efforts that we make, and that we get a benefit from doing that. So I just want to put that on the record, Mr. Chairman. Thank
you very much, Senator Shaheen. That'll conclude the hearing, and I want to sincerely thank both of you for what I think has been an eye-opening experience for people who really aren't exposed to this, as we all are every day on this committee and in the lane you work in. For information of the members, the record will remain open until close of business tomorrow, May 14th. We ask the witnesses, if they do get such a question, that you respond as promptly as possible, and your response will be included in the record. Also, I'm going to enter in the record the speech that's been referred to regarding Dr. William Rudo, given April 23rd, 2025 in Beijing, China. And with that, and the thanks to the committee, the hearing is now adjourned.